We're now in the Q&A time. We have about 25 minutes for questions and discussion. So please, attendees and audience members can submit their questions through the Q&A. And if there are folks who are panelists who want to pose questions themselves, please just let me know. Send a stack to me, or send the word stack to me via the chat, and I will cue you to come on camera to ask your question. So far, I don't quite see anything just yet. Oh, okay, we have a question from Jeff. So Jeff, do you want to come on camera?
Sure. Can you hear? I'll just use my voice if that's okay. Thanks. First of all, thank you, Debbie and Justin. These are really thought-provoking, and my question arises from my desire to think these two excellent talks together. So I wanted to ask each of you to what extent the Afro-pessimist or perhaps Jacksonian invocation of the slave could be understood as an invocation of a co-presence. Deborah, you seem to ward off the idea that co-presence can be marshaled into a kind of militant political project like resistance, and that there's a kind of difficult relationality that arises in co-present relationships. And Justin, do you think there is a tension between the kind of co-presence that Deborah invites us to think about, where and the Afro-pessimist militant invocation of the slave? Thanks again so much.
I feel like that was a little bit more directed to me. I don't know, but I don't know if Debbie, you have a response now, or?
No, you go.
So you talk, Jeff, you always ask great questions. But literally, as you said that, I immediately thought about a passage from Soledad Brothers. So a little bit more context. Soledad Brothers is a collection of prison letters from George Jackson. And then Blood in My Eye is kind of is also prison letters, like written while he's in prison, but more specifically written as a more like political theoretical text. So Soledad Brother, he's like talking to his family, he's talking to his lawyers, and he's kind of just like thinking his way through his experience. But there's a way he also, I mean, the way that I'm understanding some of how Debbie's invoking co-presence, and the word haunting comes to mind. There's a way that he talks about slavery as almost like a haunting experience for him, in a way that, and again, that's where I'm pointing at this like atemporality that he's trying to invoke. And so if y'all don't mind, I'm just read a little bit from what he says, because I think he says it more brilliant than I could. But so he talks about like the past and future both consuming him, which again kind of leads him towards his position. But he says, my recall is nearly perfect. Time has faded nothing. I recall the very first kidnap. I've lived through the passage, died on the passage, lain in the unmarked shallow graves of the millions who fertilized the American soil with their corpses, cotton and corn growing out of my chest. My mind rages back and forth through the uncounted generations, and I feel all that they ever felt, but double. And then he also invokes like the idea of like, if I don't do something, then I have to be accountable to the slaves of the future. So I'm trying to end the possibility of the slaves of the future. So I don't know, again, I don't know if that's like the best reading of co-presence, but I think like, especially thinking about haunting, I think there's something there of like how he's trying to invoke this, this atemporal process, this atemporality basically.
Thank you for your question, Jeff. I think something that I'm thinking about, if I understood what you were asking correctly, something I'm thinking about is intention. And I guess like when I think about how the slave is invoked in Afro-pessimist debates or discussions, like there's something about how what the slave means or how it shows up in African studies that I think that's part of why that's part of why my conception of co-presence is to stay with the idea that they're vexed or that they are contentious, is because I think I want us to stay with the contention, and then have intention about it. So in that sense, yeah, that the slave can't be, it's not just a reparative concept, like it's a content, or however it's invoked in, I think that there needs to be kind of like more, I think we need to think about our relationship to that a bit more. And I guess in thinking about what Justin is saying with regards to the future, I think that's why as well. There's something about intention in the future and our relationship that I think can be taken for granted, if that makes sense.
Thank you both. Yeah, I was just thinking, as you all both were wrestling with Jeff's question, that at least to my mind, it seems that co-presence and structural adjustment both kind of point to the limits, or maybe even like approach a critique of kind of liberal evidentiary logics that require kind of visuality and just kind of like legibility to confirm what is. Both seem to, like, structural adjustment speaks to the way that Black political demands have to be reformulated to become legible. And that, Debbie, I hear you saying co-presence is about this kind of attunement to what exists between. So that's kind of one point of kind of parallel I hear. We do have two questions that have come in from the audience. So the first one I'll read is from Wilton Shreka. Wilton writes, is non-reformist reform attainable? How I see it, we need to destroy systems first before we can think about new ways of making and being. I also want to say I truly believe in the necessity of violence. And so how would that factor into non-reformist reform? Thank you for this, Comrade Justin. Let's go burn some buildings. I guess that's directed at you, Justin, first.
Yeah, thanks, Wilton. Again, so I think what I'm trying to do is, so George Jackson's someone I've been thinking with like a lot very much this whole year. It's kind of like shifted a lot of my priorities. And I think one of the things that, I think what I'm trying to get at about like this like non-reformist reform, I think it's more so the, like this kind of like overrepresentation that I'm interested in. And so when like the way to get to abolition is through petitioning the state, it's like, okay, what other methods do we have to get toward abolition, right? And so when I'm like, Jackson is like, nothing other than a defense attack weapon now will be meaningful for the majority of slaves. I'm trying to take that seriously. There's also a point where he says like the revolutionary culture will be developed through the process of withdrawal. And so like, what does it mean to say we will develop this autonomously, essentially? And I think when I'm specifically responding to last summer, there's a way that because I remember I like wrote something immediately after things was going on. And then afterwards, I was kind of thinking about how you have people, again, people take up tactics, right? Whatever. But I think that's interesting in terms of like trying to theorize about a tactic. It's like, what does it mean for someone to like set fire to a legislative building? And then a few weeks later, somebody saying, oh, we need to petition that same legislative building to like change the budget. It's like, well, so the people who are saying this legislative building cannot give me freedom, now we're saying, no, we need to issue demands towards it. So I'm like, okay, so who, and then, looking at reports, I kind of looked at a lot of reports from a lot of like folks on the ground in these different cities as it's happening. It's like that shift happens and a lot of those folks who had that initial energy just disappeared. And again, I'm not in conversation with them, and I'm not seeing exactly who these people are, because a lot of them are, you know, discreet and obscure. But it's like, I think it's interesting to think about how does trying to channel that energy into a petition, the people who are already like not interested in the state and don't think the state can do anything for them, I don't know if they'll be interested in a budget session, you know? So that's kind of what, I think that's my answer to you, Wilton. Thanks for that question too.
Debbie, did you want to respond to anything there, or should I go to the next? Okay. So we have a stack question from Marah. Marah, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, so thank you both. Those were just really, really excellent presentations. My question is for Justin. So I appreciate how you're thinking Wilderson and Jackson together, and I found your nod to Black communization really evocative. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to elaborate on the tensions or sort of relationship between each figure's respective position towards like socialist organizing, with Wilderson seeming, you know, citing inadequacies, but then in, yeah, so if you would be willing to elaborate, that'd be great.
Yeah. As I wrote that, I was like, I wonder how he would respond to that, because I think there's a way that specifically this article on the prison slave, he makes a comment that Black radicalism is dangerous, not because it raises the specter of an alternative polity, but that it raises the specter of like just complete destruction of civil society. And I'm interested in, I mean, I don't know. I think that destruction has to have contents, like for me, I think. And I think there's a way that George Jackson is positioning communism or communization as like the process of abolishing all relations. And so he talks about overthrowing all, he uses the language of property relations. I think he's thinking about all relations that structure the state. So I think that's why I was trying to push him a little bit. And so he says like, so I think I would argue that communization is the specter of destruction of civil society. Because I think there's a way that, I don't know, Walter Rodney makes the argument that when he's talking in his text on the Russian Revolution, he argues that basically like Western Europe leaves Russia hanging. And he's like, they leave them hanging in terms of like developing this international social revolution, because the Western European workers are getting that imperialism money. So it's like, so basically he's arguing like, so it's a way that even like socialist organization is kind of, is basically adjusted, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, sorry, I'm kind of rambling there, but yeah, I think if anything, like Blackness pushes communism to its potential. And when people talk about abolition, I think there's a way we think about abolition just as about prisons, but it's like abolition of all relations. I hope that makes sense. I could probably get more into it, but I don't want to ramble too long.
Debbie, did you want to say anything, or?
I wanted to add, so I guess what I've been thinking about is that there is a genealogy of structural adjustment in like the history of the IMF in Africa, where it doesn't mean this thing that's even in any way reparative at all, right? It's the thing that just completely obliterates the economy. And so I think that there are also ways to, I don't know what it would mean to also put that in conversation with ideas of Black freedom. But yeah, that's just something I was thinking about.
Okay, we have an audience question coming in from Brianna Eaton. This is for Debbie. How do you imagine the haunting nature of copresence in relation to histories that haven't ended, to past that aren't past, that are not past? Felicia de Jesus's work is about Santeria. So is your vision of copresence. So is your vision of copresence necessarily attached to the spiritual? I'm interested to hear you elaborate on your thoughts. Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I think working in religious studies or working with religious material, there's always that question of like, how do you write about the spiritual, and is it real, or what does that mean? And I would say yes. And I think what's often tricky about academia is how I think that academia has like a fear of the secular, even when it's talking about the spiritual, even when it's trying to admit to what's not sort of what can be studied. And so, yeah, I do think that the spiritual is a part of the conceptualization, but I don't know that. I think that we would have to think about how we think about what knowledge is and how we receive information. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'll go to a question for Justin. This is from Donnell Williamson. Justin, what becomes the end goal for the captive? Once an individual like George Jackson accepts captivity, there seems to be a structural adjustment to the lie, American equality and justice for all, and the reality of the Black captive. If realizing the end goal becomes too Afrofuturistic, what does structural adjustment say about the collective Black conscious for those who have not yet adjusted? I'll read it again if you want me to. Yeah.
I'm looking at it.
Oh, okay.
Donnell also asked good questions. Oh man, I wish I could like see you for this question. Oh, that's so difficult. Season of adjustment to the lie and the reality of the Black captive, realizing the end goal becomes too Afrofuturistic, who have yet adjusted. I think, I don't know, the best way I could try to answer this, and maybe if you like, I don't know, can you do the chat? I mean, maybe if you want to add like maybe a little bit more, maybe that'll help me. But I think the best thing I can think of to respond, I mean, I guess like to say like the end goal for like Jackson is, again, like communist revolution, and specifically thinking about this at the level of like internationalism, because he, early in Blood in My Eye, he talks about how the movement in the United States has finally arrived at thinking about socialist revolution, communist revolution, in the conversation with the rest of the third world. So so I would say that is the end goal. I'm sorry, I don't really know what else to say, at least right now, but we can talk more on it.
We have a question from Felicia next up. So Felicia, would you come on to share your question?
Thank you. Yeah, these were really wonderful. And I also wanted to think across the two presentations, but this was sparked by Debbie's, something that you said. So I'm thinking about the idea of psychic demand that each concept entails or revolves around to some extent. And Debbie, you said something like copresence is demanding. And so I've been thinking a lot about how there's a resurgence to a return to African indigenous religions, maybe as a kind of adjusting or adjustment. But what falls out is how demanding those the relationships to spirit are incredibly taxing and can even be abusive, in my own, seeing in Haiti and traveling and seeing some of these hauntings, possession, etc. So I'm thinking about demand in that regard, or even the cry that I talked about, how demanding it almost is to hear it, or exhausting maybe is a better word. And then Justin, there's a psychic demand in asking people to remain unadjusted. And so, so I was just wondering if both of you could talk to this idea of either psychic demand or sacrifice, or like whatever I just strung together. Okay.
Wow, that's a really good question. Yeah, I'm thinking also about weight, right? And weight in terms of tipping scales. And I guess something that I've been thinking about a lot as I was writing, thinking about the Catherine, I was looking, just on Twitter and just looking at people talking about how black people that voted, or people who voted for the Democrats, must answer for Palestine. And it's a huge demand. And I think it was making me sort of like think about, and this is related to the question, I saw a question in the chat, but thinking about what a multicultural, this multiracial society allows and demands, thinking about, I forget her name, the mayor of Chicago, who's like the first Black lesbian mayor of Chicago, thinking about Kamala and how she has also been used in this imperatives, but there's always a demand. And I think that that's sort of what I find so powerful about the concept of co-presence is that that demand will show up, and it might be abusive because the world is abusive. And so, yeah, I think that, I think that's a really good place to sort of like stay with why it's important, is to think about what the demand is gonna ask us to do. So yeah, thank you.
Felicia, another person that always asks brilliant questions. So I ran to get the book because I think Wilderson himself. So after the quote that I said at the beginning, where he's like, "Social death is destroyed by assuming, not disavowing the position." After that, I didn't include it in the presentation because I figured it would probably come up at this point. After that, he literally says, "However, as Black people, we are often psychically unable and unwilling to assume this position. This is as understandable as it is impossible." And I think it's fascinating that he says that immediately, like, this is what is necessary, but it's also impossible. And I was literally talking to someone about this like yesterday, and I was like, at one level it's impossible because, again, like, adjustment is at the level of like psychic, but it's also at the level of literally state violence. And again, like, as I mentioned, part of this adjustment is literally like the people who, the Black Liberation Army, Black Panther Party, is like, these people are literally were met with the violent hand of the state. And a lot of, you hear from, I was on the talk with like Jalil Mutakim, a former BLA member, who like was literally just released after like almost 50 years in prison, or over 50 years in prison. And like the question that they, say is like, we found ourselves at the point of repression of the state to where we had to continue this trajectory of armed resistance. And then he said we were not able to convince people of the necessity of defense. And so I guess like the demand, the psychic demand is so like, even as myself, I'm writing this, right? And I understand like the impossibility and the difficulty of that demand. And like, as you asked, as I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about even last summer, these protests, and the state brought out tanks and everything at a level I've never seen before. And I was like, admittedly, like afraid. I was like, what is this? Like, they could literally smash all of this if they wanted to. And this is literally just people peacefully protesting. So yeah, it is a psychic demand. And I think like what I'm interested in is like, and honestly, if we think of Jackson and maybe like engage his, like, for example, maybe like Soledad brother very closely, like you could tell, like he gets this position through like some very like maybe an adjustment in a very different direction, and like to where he's like, I'm trying to weed every bit of the West out of my body. Like, I'm making to myself where I have no need for hunger. Because I mean, he's literally under the state of solitary confinement. So like he arrives at this position under very under duress. So yeah, so I guess like there's no answer of like, what does it take to overcome that psychic difficulty? But I think there's something about, and again, maybe that's where like thinking like at the level of something like co-presence could be interesting, because I think it's something at the level of, I think it's at the level of like relation, at the level of like, I guess like building that capacity. And I think when he says like something for like the people to defend and attack now, I think it's like, you know, people can't, you know, like won't be inspired to defend nothing that they haven't built, right? So it's like, how do we engage in that process? So that's what I'm thinking about, Felicia, but I appreciate that question.
Thank you both, Justin and Debbie. We're at the end of our time for Q&A, but I do just want to thank the both of you for two really stimulating and really just provocative opening concepts. So thank you. So everyone, please do remember to log off of the webinar and log back on at 1. So we're going to take a break for lunch, and please refer all continued conversation to the Slack channels. And we have 2 remaining questions. I'm going to quickly read them just so everyone has them in their head, and then I'll publish them so that folks can see them and continue the conversation. One question is from Khalid Love, and it says, this idea of multicultural white supremacy seems to speak to how the state can co-opt what we might call multicultural resistance. The state is stealthy and can often mask itself as its own resistance in order to maintain its permanence and legitimacy. How can we articulate an idea of resistance to the state that resists co-optation by the state? Should that articulation of resistance be one that is solely ideological, or must it be embodied in some way? That's a really dope question. So let's pick that up in the Slack. And then the last question we have from Zuri Arman is, what are the limitations you see in the grammars afforded by Christianity, especially as they pertain to humanism, as you mentioned? Are there new grammars that could perhaps shed these co-presences, if I'm understanding co-presences correctly? I'm still mulling over your words. Okay, so those are the 2 questions we have. Thanks so much, everybody, and please let's be engaged in the Slack. See you all at 1.